Welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Gear. I'm the Dean of Admissions at Southwestern Law School. And tonight my objective is to hopefully give you some great information about the components of the application itself, how these different elements are viewed by the admissions committee. Of course, I want to answer some of your questions. So in case you missed me mentioning this as you were entering the room, we have 2 current students as well as members of the admissions office in the chat, so you can send your written questions there. I will prompt also for some oral questions from time to time, so you will either raise your physical hand or you will use the raise hand feature within Zoom, and our Associate Director, Nancy Rojas Hill, will call on you, and then you can ask your question live for me to answer. So hopefully you find the information to be helpful. Keep track of your questions so that if you want to be able to ask it live, you will remember it by the time we get to you. And then anything, of course, that we don't cover tonight and you have subsequent questions regarding, you are welcome to email me. My email address is lgear@swlaw.edu. I'm sure you'll see that in other capacities as well, but if you want to jot that down, feel free. And as you probably noticed, we are doing the closed captioning. So anybody that's speaking, you'll also be closed captioned just as you're seeing this now. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so these are the various components of a law school application. It may vary slightly from school to school, but these are going to be the primary elements. We get 2 electronic documents for each applicant when they apply. The first is the Credential Assembly Service Report, or CAS report, and it shows there what the various elements are. The banner sheet, which is going to be like the summary of everything that's in your record, undergraduate and graduate, as well as LSAT score or scores. We'll get copies of your transcripts. We'll get copies of the LSAT writing sample, and your letters of recommendation are also part of the CAS report. The second file that we receive is your, what we call Flex app, otherwise known as the electronic application. And that is where schools have the opportunity to, of course, ask you any particular questions that they want to know about you. And then it's also the document that you're going to submit or attach, rather, your personal statement, any other optional statements, the resume, any addenda, whether or not some of those are optional, some of those are required. So that's just an overview. Okay, for the LSAT or Lsat Flex, as we are currently experiencing, the Lsat Flex has just been announced by LSAC to be the method of test administration through the April 21 tests. They had just actually sent this out today. So if you haven't yet signed up for an upcoming LSAT, registrations are available and open for the January through April administrations. You can see there the Lsat Flex is 2 hours long. It's done at home or in some other environment where you have access to the internet. There are 4 sections. All of those are required, including the writing sample, which is a prompt that LSAC will give you, and you will pick one argument. It doesn't matter what you write on, meaning it doesn't matter which side of the argument you take, but do take it seriously, because it is definitely something that admissions offices and admissions committees do read. The degree in which they are read can also vary from school to school and also between file to file. So if, it's an opportunity for us to kind of see you writing under pressure, it's the only opportunity we have in that regard. Okay, so the banner sheet, when you see it all in total, is got a lot of really small little numbers and small little words. So I'm just breaking it up into different chunks so that you can actually see it better on the screen. So this is the top third. We get a little bit of information in terms of who you are, your major, all of your institutions that you've attended and submitted transcripts for are listed under the institutions attended section on that upper right. Any kinds of transcript notes, things like academic honors, or sometimes other things like academic probation. Anything that's a note literally from your transcript shows up there. So that's important to keep in mind, because if you do have things like academic disqualifications or academic problems, there are questions usually like that ask about that on the application itself. So you want to make sure that you are being consistent in all of your acknowledgements. There is definitely the potential that if you do not disclose that, and we'll get into this in the character and fitness section later, that could lead to some trouble for you. Okay, so the middle, it's not quite a third, it's more than a third, but the middle section of the banner sheet has all of these numbers. You don't really need, because you're not admissions officers, you don't really need to understand all of these things so intimately, but I want to kind of give you a sense of how we are able to, at a quick glance, see how well you've done in your educational history, as well as how you may compare to people from your same undergraduate school. So if you see in the top row, it says degree school. I've highlighted just a particular section, and it shows, you know, that I'm going to reference that 5% there in just a second, under the 45 to 49 band. Then it shows the years under transcript analysis. It shows the years in which you've attended these various schools, or singular school if that happens to be your case. That same thing we saw here where you can see the school code, it tracks when we get to this, so that school code is 4707. That's what that row is referencing. And then we see the purple arrow is pointing to the number of units or semester hours that you had taken in each of those years. The green arrow is pointing to the GPA that you earned in each of those incremental sections. That's important to understand because what LSAC does, now in this example, this person only had attended one university or one college, but it's important to understand that LSAC will take all of the transcripts that you submit. So if you attended community college at any point, whether or not it was even in high school and you took some college courses, or you transferred from community college to a four-year university, LSAC will take all of the grades that you've earned and they will combine them. And that's what the red circled cum across GPA is a reflection of. So again, this is perhaps a bad example because it's only one school, but if you do have units, as I mentioned, from another institution, all of those things will get recalculated. And so oftentimes that GPA, which is the official GPA that all law schools will use, sometimes that GPA is different than the GPA you may be familiar with from your undergraduate institution. So sometimes that goes up, sometimes it goes down. So to help illustrate that further, if you were a person who transferred from community college, and we have many of our applicants who have attended community college, you got whatever grades that you earned. By the time you transferred, you had a clean slate in terms of GPA. Let's say it was at UCLA. You started at UCLA as a junior with credits under your belt because you transferred from a community college, but you didn't have any grades. So everything that you had ultimately on your UCLA transcript was the grades that you earned only at UCLA. The GPA, however, that LSAC will be calculating is the combination of everything combined. So if you had straight A's in community college and then transferred, that might be a good example of why you might see your LSAC combined GPA to be increased. Okay, so I mentioned that we're going to talk about that 45 to 49 and the 5. That's going to be here in this lower portion. You take what we do when we're reviewing the file is we have the opportunity to see how you did percentile wise on the LSAT. So if I want to understand how you did relative to your peers over a 3-year period from your undergraduate school, I can look at that percent rank, and this person with their 150 was in the 45th percentile. And again, going back to where 45 is here from the degree school, I can see, right, there were 5% of people from that same school over 3 years who scored in that same general area of the LSAT, which made them the top 36% of test takers from that school. Okay, so that, again, it just gives us a little bit of information about how, you know, you fared compared to your peers. That's perhaps less important from our large feeder schools because we're already kind of familiar with the talent from those schools, and perhaps more helpful in situations where we're not as familiar with those undergraduate schools. Okay. So again, here's that same red circle GPA that I mentioned. We also are given the degree GPA, which is the GPA from specifically the undergraduate university. In this particular example, they are one and the same, but they are often not. This bottom portion will also tell us how many letters of recommendation you've submitted, as well as if there's been any misconduct or irregularity. That's something we can touch upon later, and lets us know if you have attended any other schools. Okay, so I'm leading with all of this information first because my particular preference when I'm reviewing a file, and this is one of the many ways in which this is subjective, is I tend to read the CAS report first, right? Remember I mentioned at the beginning that we get the 2 electronic files. It's really up to the reader which file they want to open. It's literally a PDF. I tend to read the CAS report first. So after I've looked at the banner sheet, looked at your actual transcripts, read over your writing sample, the next thing up in the report are going to be your letters of recommendation. So I don't know of any law school that doesn't have you submit letters of recommendation. Some schools, they're optional. Some schools like Southwestern, they are required. So we do require at least 1 letter of rec and a maximum of 3. Again, those numbers are going to vary from school to school, but they allow us to hear about you as a candidate through the lens of a third party. Not necessarily an unbiased third party, because hopefully this is a person or persons who are advocating for you, but it does lend additional insight. So I've got some samples for you. This prospective student here, Tom Cruise, is 26 years old, male, had a 150 LSAT score, a 3.28 GPA, went to a local state university, majored in criminal justice. You can see there's the excerpt itself, talking about how strong this person was in their presentations and their writing, that he excelled. He always came prepared to class. He had elaborate and interesting questions. Talked about how he came to night classes after he worked. And then in the margin, you also see some of the elements that the person also, Tom Cruise, also discussed in his personal statement. So again, right, we're looking at, we're focusing on the letter of recommendation specifically, but of course, when we're reading a file, we're looking at everything in its totality. And as we continue reviewing elements in the file, the subjectivity part for the reviewer is, it's natural to make assumptions, both good and bad, about a candidate. And as we continue to move through the various elements, it either supports our assumptions or it gives us something else to consider. Okay, some additional excerpts. Again, talking about how Mr. Cruz stood out amongst his peers, talking about how he was diligent, he came to office hours. He also had the opportunity to be a legal assistant. So he came to the law school application process already having had some legal work under his belt. Talked about his ability to think analytically and to solve difficult problems, a hard work ethic, diligence, careful with deadlines. Okay, so some tips for letters of recommendation. Honestly, any one of these topics we could spend an hour on easily. We don't have that luxury tonight, so I'm definitely kind of giving you the overview, but consider academic versus professional. We don't in particular have a requirement that says it has to be academic. Some schools do. You of course want to follow the directions of whatever school you're applying to. But the general rule of thumb is if you are coming out of school plus or minus 2 years, I would suggest an academic letter if you think you can access one. Choosing someone who knows you, that's really also important. It was clear to me, and I hope to you in the excerpts, that those recommenders really knew the candidate. They really knew Tom. They not only could speak to his successes in the classroom, they were also able to convey personal qualities that should be qualities we would also be looking for, right? Academic to academic. When you are soliciting your recommenders to write however many letters for you, I always suggest you ask them those 3 questions there in the middle of the screen. Ask them if they'd be willing to write a letter of recommendation for your law school application. They need to know what this is for, right? It's not just a general letter. Ask them if they'd be able to submit the letter for you by whatever date that you're asking. My suggestion is at least about 6 weeks before you plan to submit your application. That just gives them a little bit of wiggle room, and it allows you to not have to stress out so much to make sure everything comes together. And then the third question, most important question, would the letter be a positive endorsement? It may seem silly to ask that because hopefully for all of you, you wouldn't be considering asking anybody to write a letter for you that you didn't think was going to be excellent. But based on the letters that I have seen over my many years and that my colleagues have seen, they are not always positive. Sometimes they're very lukewarm, sometimes they're actually negative. So if you get any kind of pushback when you are asking these questions, if the person is saying, oh, I'm really not sure, I'm really busy. Or, oh, I didn't know you wanted to go to law school. Are you sure this is for you? Anything of that nature, just thank them for their time and move on to another person on your list, because you don't want to put your fate in the hands of somebody who doesn't really believe this is going to be the right thing for you. Okay. The 4th tip, choose someone who can accentuate your accomplishments. If you have things in your background, either professionally or academically, if you were selected to be part of an honors program at your school, if you were given a particular prestigious project in your employment, whatever that looks like for you, you can use the letters of recommendation and the recommender to help support and to also acknowledge those strengths, because again, this is going to come from a third party, and that is going to give it additional weight. Okay, and then the last tip, being concise. You do not need to submit the maximum number of letters to each school unless you really feel that each letter is going to add value. So I mentioned there, be judicious in all aspects of crafting the application. I cannot underscore that enough. Everything you submit in both its individual capacity and its totality is a reflection on your judgment, good, bad, or otherwise. So you want to be as objective as you can with your materials. Really ask yourself if all of these things, if this whole package is the best version that you want to submit of your application, and then you can move forward with confidence. Okay, so before we move on to the next thing, we'll go ahead and take some live questions. Nancy, whenever you're ready. Nancy, if you're saying anything, I can't hear you.
So sorry. Please feel free to raise your hand is what I was saying, and I'll call on you. I don't see any hands at this time, but a common question we get, and that was in the chat, was how old is too old for a letter of recommendation?
It's a good question. How old is too old? I think it depends. So one thing I didn't mention, and I guess I could have as a tip, is if you are still in school, even if you're a person that indicated on the poll that you're considering law school in 2022 or 23, or you're not sure, you might want to go ahead and try and solidify and get that letter from your favorite professor or advisor and have that on file. You have an LSAC account, and that's where your letters will live and ultimately be dispatched from. So if you have a letter there, even if it's 2 or 3 years old, it may still be your best bet for, let's say, an academic letter. If by the time you get around to applying, what if that person has retired or moved schools or you've lost touch or something like that? So In that particular instance, I think it's okay to have a letter that's 2 or more years old. Ideally, though, they wouldn't be more than a year old. This is particularly true if you are someone who is reapplying to a law school. If you've already applied to, say, Southwestern and did not get in and you are reapplying, it is essential that you get at least one new letter of recommendation, as well as write a new personal statement.
Okay.
That's not mentioned anywhere else, but I thought I'd throw that in
there. Good mention. Emir has his hand up, so
yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you guys for taking the time to do this. This is actually very, very helpful. And my question is just piggybacking off the mention of a year. So I graduated college in 2019, and I've been working and I intend to apply this cycle. And I had one of my professors write that letter of rec for me back in 2019. So it's been over a year, and my other 2 recommendations are professional recommendations. Would I want to sub one out and possibly reach out to one of my former professors to try to get another academic letter, since the one I have that is academic was written over a year ago?
And to clarify, your professional letters are more current?
Yes, they're current. They're my current bosses.
I think that's perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify with the year. Thank you so much.
No problem, sure. Any other live questions? No? Okay, we'll move on.
Right now, yeah.
Okay, so personal statements. Why law schools use them? It's not to torture our applicants, although I'm sure it probably feels like that at times. It is a formal writing sample. I mentioned that the writing sample from the LSAT is the informal version, writing under pressure. Your personal statement is exactly the opposite. There should be, any concession that we make for grammar or typos or fragmented sentences, any of those concessions we make in the LSAT writing sample, we do not make them in the personal statement. Your personal statement should be perfection as far as those things are concerned. You've had all the time in the world essentially to craft it, and so we use it to learn more about the candidate. We use it in place of an interview in most cases. I often say it's like your written interview. It's a reflection of your judgment and your professionalism. It helps schools, such as ours and each reviewer of your file, right? That's another thing I haven't mentioned yet. Your file is most likely going to be reviewed by multiple people, and each person brings their own subjectivity and bias to the process. But regardless of that subjectivity, they still want to get to know who each person is as a potential fit for our community. Okay, so here's an example. People often ask me about opening paragraphs and closing, so I do have a sample of each for you. So this candidate, Nicole, female, 22, had a 154 LSAT, a 3.76. She graduated from UCLA, but she did transfer from community college. She was an English major. Her letters of recommendation, she had 1 academic and 1 professional. The academic letter cited her strong critical thinking skills and that she was honest and willing to challenge herself. The law firm letter was also able to assess that she had strong analytical and research skills, and she was able to apply that in their workplace to solve difficult problems. So I'll give you a minute to read this opening here. One of the things that people are often asking about the personal statement is how to begin, right? It is a little bit of a creative writing piece. This is on the more creative side. Personally, I wouldn't go too much more beyond this. As I mentioned, it is often considered a written interview. So you want to, of course, make sure you're following whatever instructions the school has given you for the personal statement. Many have no question specifically that they ask you to answer. So those are probably the hardest because they're just open-ended. We want to see what you come up with. So in those situations, again, revert back to thinking of this like a written interview and think about the topics that would be appropriate, that would be a good reflection of your judgment and that would allow you to really shine. Okay. Here's the closing paragraph in the same personal statement. So the candidate was able to tie in some specifics about Southwestern and to make sure that, you know, she kind of wove her experiences of wanting to help in her community and helping underprivileged communities. And she kind of tied all of that together, I think, really nicely. Hopefully you'll agree. It's fairly common, you'll see at her very last sentence, in fact, it's very common for applicants to make very bold statements about themselves and what having a law degree or a law degree from Southwestern will allow them to do. You don't have to do that, but it is a fairly common strategy. You do need to close it somehow. And so that tends to be something that people do. So here are some tips for the personal statement. You want to be accurate. I mentioned following the directions. That's incredibly important. Being personal. Definitely write from the first person. Be sincere. Be genuine. This is one of the few places in your application where you actually get to allow yourself and your accomplishments to shine through. So that goes right into number 3 about being confident. This is the place where you sing your praises. This is the place where you say how awesome you are, because if you don't say it, no one else might. And you really want to make sure that if it comes down to ultimately your application or someone else's application, you want to make sure that you've been really, really careful about showcasing all the things that you can bring to the table. Be impactful. No one else's story will be like yours. And this is true even if, you know, if you happen to have siblings or other family members who want to go to law school, I guarantee you they will not have the same story. They could have lived through the same experiences, but their lens will be different. Their bias will be different. So tell your story, whatever that looks like. Being meticulous, that's almost kind of looks like a section of don'ts, which we're going to follow with here. But being meticulous, again, I said at the very beginning of this topic, there is no excuse for any kind of mistakes. You want to make sure that everything is really, really top notch. Okay, the diversity statements or optional statements. People ask about this all the time. If you should do them, how do you do them? What do you talk about? So I just want to briefly kind of give you some perspective on that. You should follow all of the same tips, both the do's and coming up the don'ts, that you would have for the personal statement. So you want to make sure, again, you're following any instructions that they give, but you can, you know, take a step back. I mentioned earlier about being concise and being thoughtful about all the different things that you submit. If you feel like there is something else that you haven't yet covered in the personal statement, or perhaps you only barely covered, then that's where you can consider writing a diversity statement or an optional essay. You do not need to write one just for the sake of writing one, okay? But I mentioned here some of the topics that you can include, some of the ones we've seen a little bit more often. Chances are there's 1,000 others that I did not mention here, obviously for space considerations. So diversity is it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. I think there's some misperceptions about what that means, and if you should or shouldn't write a diversity statement, it's really up to you. One of the ways that I encourage applicants to think about the difference between them is that, you know, when you're writing your personal statement, and one of the techniques that I recommend is you do a lot of free writing. Think about various topics that you might want to write your personal statement on. You can't write about everything, so you're going to have to make some choices. But maybe there's a topic that you considered for your personal statement, but maybe it just is better suited for a diversity statement. That could be a way where you could break up the topics as opposed to writing too long of a single personal statement. Just break it up. It's more pleasurable for the reader. Okay. So what not to do. Again, this is only a list of 10 things. I could write 1,001 more of don'ts. Unfortunately, there's a lot more don'ts than there are do's. which maybe makes you feel a little bit better, I'm not sure, but you don't want to offend the reader. And you may not even realize you're offending the reader, but again, think of this as a written interview. You do not know anything about the person that normally interviews you in an in-person interview. You don't know about their personal beliefs. It's the same thing with reading a file. You don't know what my personal beliefs are or any of the members of our admissions committee. So keep things professional. That's not to say you can't write about sensitive topics. People write all the time about political topics or social justice topics, and that can be polarizing. But that's the same type of, outlook we have in the classroom. People have different thoughts and people have different viewpoints, and it's okay to have them and it's okay to discuss them. But we just need to know you can do so in a professional and civil manner, okay? Don't use quotes that aren't particularly meaningful to you. This is actually a really big one of my don'ts. It's a pet peeve of mine. I do not like quotes in personal statements. They sometimes are just like the header to a statement, and they just kind of like drop it in there, or they just throw in a quote. I don't care for it. I've never thought any quote with, something about Robert Frost in there has been persuasive in a personal statement. So feel free to leave that out. That is different than like a mantra, okay? Some people do have like a mantra that they live by. I definitely think that's different. Don't talk too much about someone else. Don't spend 3/4 of your personal statement talking about how influential your grandmother might have been. That's lovely, but not something you would do in an in-person interview, so skip it here. Don't also spend time talking about the wrong school. This is where we go back to being meticulous. If you are the type that thinks you're going to write one personal statement and only swap out the school name, you better do it right. Because if you write in there about how you can't wait to go to some other law school, I'm going to hope you get into that other law school and I'm going to deny your application. So, and I definitely have done so for that very reason. Don't spend time in your personal statement talking about shortcomings. Remember, you're going to be confident in those documents. You're going to sell all of the wonderful qualities that you have. You're not going to focus on things that maybe you don't do so well at. You can talk about those somewhere else. Don't regurgitate your resume. Don't feel like you need to have a sob story. You don't. Everybody deals with something in life. And if that's what you want to talk about in your personal statement, great, but it doesn't have to be. And don't assume you will get another chance to make a first impression. For the vast majority of our applicants, the application that they submit is the only impression that they get to make. Most people do not get any kind of interview opportunity or anything like that. So this is really it. Okay, so before we talk about the resume, we'll go ahead and take some questions. I do see a note here that there are 2 people who've raised their hand.
Yeah, let's start with Elizabeth this time.
Hi, thank you all for hosting this. I know I've done the personal statement workshop and I've really been working on my personal statement and editing it and kind of making it work alongside the diversity statement. And I'm still feeling like I'm not necessarily regurgitating my resume, but there's a bit at the beginning where I feel like I'm just like talking about like quite a few different like service organizations and other things that I have been a part of and done, but it all kind of like serves that narrative. And I'm struggling, I guess, to find a balance between talking about like the path as a whole versus just narrowing in on very specific moments. And I was wondering if you had any tips or recommendations for that.
Hi, Elizabeth. It's nice to see you again. As we've said before, it is really hard, and I so appreciate that you are actually still in the struggle of it. I don't know if this would be helpful to you or not, honestly, but maybe consider taking out the resume. If you don't have it in there, it's not going to look as much like a regurgitation. But also consider talking about something totally different then and leaving the resume in there, right? I mean, I kind of feel like you can only go one way or the other if you do feel like you're skirting the line of regurgitating your resume. Perhaps as a third alternative, pick one thing. Just pick one thing that may be on your resume and just go wild with it in the personal statement and let that be your sole focus. I mean, besides that, honestly, I really don't know what else I could tell you about that. Some people, and maybe the concept of regurgitation is relative. Some people literally just string extra words together from what they've had on their resume, and that becomes their personal statement. It's a true regurgitation. I don't consider picking a few elements out of your resume, and expanding on them in the personal statement to be a regurgitation. So maybe there's also considering that, as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely feel like there are some things like that didn't necessarily have a spot on my resume are intermingled with some things that do. So it feels to me almost like it's walking that line of, is it partially regurgitation, or am I telling the narrative of me that my resume also reflects in some capacity?
Have you been able to give it to anyone else so they can have a more objective view of it?
Yeah, I'm working through some edits and I have a meeting tomorrow about it.
Okay.
So.
I mean, I would take a lot of cues, I guess, from what your readers are saying to you, right? If you have somebody kind of giving you some feedback, if they feel like it's regurgitation, then I definitely think you have some more work to do. If they don't feel quite as strongly about that, then maybe you're still okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. And then I don't see any other hands, so we'll go back to Amir again.
Thank you so much. So my question is regarding the diversity statement, in which you stated that you should showcase something about your background. And I definitely do think religion is something that plays into many applicants' backgrounds. However, from the feedback I've gotten, I've been typically told to kind of avoid the topic of religion and how that plays into your diversity. So I just want to kind of pick at your mind and see why you do say that we should include religion in the in the diversity statement, or what do you kind of reference and mean, or how you've seen it done in diversity statements in the past?
Well, I mean, I know people generally say, right, in polite conversations with people, you don't talk about things like religion or politics.
Right.
I don't know if that's the capacity in which you've been told it, or if you're referring to literally somebody said, don't talk about it in your application to law school.
So I was gonna say, like, some people say don't touch on your application of law school,
Okay.
just because you don't know where the reader's coming from. You may not know what kind of beliefs they internally hold, even though admissions counsel are supposed to be neutral.
Sure. First of all, I don't know that we are neutral.
Okay.
I'll probably just put that out there in the first place. We're not neutral in many regards, right? It's kind of our job to suss out between, thousands of applications, who's going to be a good fit. It doesn't really let us be neutral per se. We are open-minded, but that's not the same thing as neutral. I see it a lot. I don't know if it's a reflection of our applicant pool. I think that is definitely something to keep in mind. And I know you've been at some of our other workshops, and maybe you might have heard me say this before as well, that there's a fit that all applicants should be striving to find. You are looking for one or perhaps a couple schools where you're a really good fit in all ways, all of the things that are important to you and that you think are going to allow you to be successful. On the flip side, schools are doing the same thing. We're looking for people that are a good fit. And fit does not mean cookie cutter. Doesn't mean everybody is like the other person. So it's hard. It's hard to figure out that fit. A lot of people tend to lead with their quantitative numbers, that LSAT and that GPA, and they look on some charts and they say, oh, okay, well, at these 20 schools, I fit, where I would want to be competitive based on these numbers. And that's an okay place to start, but hopefully you're going to pick a law school ultimately based on more than just that, more than just where your numbers say you fit, or more than just where that scholarship might offer you. Hopefully it's in totality that you're also going to have other factors. So going back to the question about religion, there are different law schools out there that have their own internal different communities and belief systems. So I can imagine for some institutions that may be very liberal or very conservative, they may not value having diverse students the same. It's going to be whatever it is for their institution, right? And how they value those things internally. I know at Southwestern, we really value diversity. And so maybe it's just as simple as we get what we put out, right? So we are welcoming of it, and therefore we get a lot of different things. So we get a lot of applications. I mean, a lot of applications that talk about a lot of sensitive things, topics that you're not supposed to talk about, people tell us. So examples could be, you know, sometimes people talk about their family being part of a small religious minority in their home country and immigrating somewhere else because of that persecution. That's unfortunately fairly common. Or we talk about how sometimes those religious and cultural beliefs of their family led them to perhaps having a lot of, you know, conservative values or lack of exposure to things, and how that has helped shape their, you know, upbringing. It really varies. So religion is just one of the things that people tend to talk about. I don't know that I'd even say it's like a common thing specifically, but it definitely comes up a lot.
Perfect. You got some motion going on in my brain, so I definitely
okay,
that was
good.
very, very helpful.
Good. Nancy, you want to take another question?
Yeah, we have Angie Gonzalez. She's had her hand up for a little bit.
Hi, Angie.
Hi, thank you guys for hosting this. I did have a question that popped up off, I think, another question. But in terms of like resume and personal statements, is there anything ever like on a resume that you guys kind of question, well, why wasn't this brought up? For me personally, like I did a lot of volunteer work between like 2014 to 2017, and I was having a hard time deciding whether I wanted to talk about that in my personal statement. But then I was like, if I don't bring it up, is it kind of weird? Does it leave it like a question mark to you guys, whether it was impactful to me or not?
I mean, maybe we've asked ourselves that as readers from time to time. I guess it depends on how we felt about your personal statement and what you did choose to share. You know, that's just the subjectivity, I guess, of the process again. But, you know, depending upon what you decided to write your personal statement about. So let's say, for example, you wrote your personal statement about, I don't know, a class that you took that really opened up your eyes and it made you see the world in a different way, and it made you want to go to law school. And in the course of that, you never talked about all of this really, really vast, you know, volunteer work that you did, you know, cleaning up the beaches, let's just say, right? Obviously, I'm making everything up. Those topics don't really go together. So I wouldn't expect necessarily to see about your volunteer work in your personal statement if the things did not align. So I would see that you took an opportunity with your resume, to highlight the thing or the things that you didn't in the personal statement. So ideally the resume can accent and enhance, you know, other things that you've experienced and had a chance to become a part of. They don't always weave together though, and come through in something like the personal statement. So, I mean, the screen we have up now is, you know, is talking about the resume. So for people who worked while they went to school, it can be helpful to us to understand, you know, what kinds of other obligations that you had, and perhaps also, again, the assumptions I mentioned that we're making, how that led to your grade performance. Was it really, really good? Did you not do so well? Those kinds of things. So it's just other information. For us, the resume is optional. I know other schools, some of them do have it as a required element. I didn't put any don'ts on here specifically, but well, there's the omit activities that precede college. Leave off anything that's high school related. Also, it looks format wise like a employment resume. It can be very similar. And you can also leave off things like an objective, because we know your objective is to get into law school. But if I don't see any problem with your personal statement not touching upon your extensive volunteer work if they really are just totally different topics.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Do we have time, Lisa, to address both Hugo and Eliana's questions?
Sure.
Okay, Hugo, go ahead.
Hi, Lisa. So my question is about it's about the personal statement and how I've written like several drafts of the personal statement, but the reason I can and never like found a good one is when I read it back to me, I wrote about my like, volunteer work and social justice and stuff like that. But when I read it back, it sounds like, well, like anybody could have, written this. Like, a lot of people volunteer, a lot of people, go out and protest and marches and during ARC and whatnot. And then when I wrote my diversity statement, when I started writing my diversity statement, I wrote about my race, my cultural background, and my foreign schooling, and how I've lived in different countries and stuff like that. And then when I read that, I was like, well, this is like the most personal, like telling thing I've written so far. So so my question is, I wonder if I could take that essay that I wrote for the diversity statement and use it as my personal statement.
So in terms of topics, sure. I don't see any, there's a lot of overlap in terms of topics between personal statement and diversity statement. They are sometimes exactly the same things, again, because ours is an open-ended prompt. That being said, there are common topics that applicants tend to write about. So I'm fully expecting this year to read a lot of personal statements about COVID. I'm fully expecting to read statements of, about things that people are seeing and witnessing in the world and how that is sparking their desire to go to law school. So if everybody chose to not write about those, then I would read none of them, right? So I wouldn't worry so much if the direction you've gone with your personal statement, if you think it's engaging, that's an important part. And if you think it's well written, and it is your story, right? These are things that have been important to you. I wouldn't shy away necessarily from still submitting that if you feel like you want to share all of these different things about yourself. So that's going to be your call. That's the judgment you have to make. But I think it sounds okay to me in the way you've described it so far.
Thank you.
Sure. Eliana?
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
First and foremost, thank you for hosting this event and prior events these past few weeks. So my question is that if our gap in resume, I know there has been a few questions regarding that in the chat. If the gap in my resume per se is due to a cultural, like to my cultural background, should I include that within the diversity statement or its own statement?
By gap, and I apologize, I haven't seen anything in the chat. So by gap, do you mean breaks between employment, or are you really referring to a lack of experience?
A little bit of both.
So we do sometimes encourage applicants in an addenda to write about gaps in their education, right? Starting and stopping school for longer periods of time. I suppose you could consider writing an addendum on the gap in your professional experience. I didn't say this, but I did mention that we make assumptions when we review files, and as I go through and I'm looking to see are my assumptions right or wrong, one of the things that an applicant can really do is to kind of get out ahead of my assumptions. And one way you do that, or the way that you do that, is to be more objective about the things that you're submitting, the documents, whoever is writing on your behalf, et cetera, all these things in totality. And if you can look and see that there might be a red flag, so going back to something about like the transcript, if you see, some failed classes, one failed class isn't necessarily something I would want to draw attention to. If you failed a lot of classes, you should explain it. If you have a lot of W's, you should explain it, right? Because again, I'm making assumptions based on the things that I see. So if the applicant takes the opportunity in an addenda and or in their addenda section to address what they think could be question marks or red flags, we're pretty good about just taking that stuff at face value. As my comment earlier, being pretty open-minded. So if you tell me why you had gaps, if you think that might have been a concern, then you don't have to worry what I might otherwise perceive the gaps to have been the cause of. Whether or not you choose to write about that in a diversity statement versus an addendum, that's a different story. So you have to kind of assess which is the better place to do that. But you may want to write about it somewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna keep going now. Okay, so I've mentioned a few times here talking about various addenda. So this is the section of your application. Generally, it's optional, except for, I guess addenda is kind of like a overarching umbrella of additional things, and that can include also character and fitness responses. Those are required. So if we put those aside for a second, submitting addenda is basically, again, as I was just mentioning, taking the opportunity to explain away something that needs a little bit of attention. So I mentioned previously that you don't want to spend your personal statement talking about why you have bad grades in school or why you don't test well or, you know, anything negative. You want to address it, but you want to do it in the appropriate format. And so usually when you write, you know, your addendum about one topic, it can generally be 1 or 2 paragraphs at most. You don't need to really belabor the point. Just say what you need to say. Don't worry about it being, you know, an excuse or being perceived as an excuse. If you write it that way, that's how we'll read it. But if you're just giving us contextual information, that's generally the best way to go. But you can also use an addendum to highlight, you know, important things or special things that have happened. So if you were selected again for a program or given a really important project at work, maybe if this is also something that's happened after you originally submitted your application, and then you want to email the admissions office and add something to your file, all of that technically falls under that heading of addenda. So your character and fitness questions, though, as I mentioned, those are required disclosures. So every single law school that I know of has some kind of character and fitness questions. They run the gamut from asking about any, you know, criminal charges that you may have had, to academic difficulty that you may have experienced, civil lawsuits, military, you know, experience that has gone awry, everything kind of in between there. The best thing I can tell you is read the question very, very carefully. There are a lot of nuances between applications from different schools. We do not ask the questions the same way. So I know our questions are very explicit. We want to know all sorts of things. And in particular, our application in this section tells you to even disclose things to us that have previously been expunged. Now, I'm going to give you all a little bit of a tip here. For those of you who might have had some legal trouble in the past and been able to get something expunged, oftentimes when applicants consult an attorney, the attorney will say, well, you don't have to tell them it was expunged, which basically, you know, in some respects sort of means like it didn't happen, right? You get kind of a do-over. But it did happen, and we are specifically telling you that we want the information. It didn't actually vanish. There is still technically a record. So one of the reasons why that schools ask this type of information is, as I mentioned, you know, we are looking for the right fit of students. We are building a community of people, but we also ask this information because at the tail end of law school, when you're all applying for, you know, the California bar or for whatever bar exam in your state, there is some kind of application. California, they call it the moral character application. And it's an incredibly invasive background check. And it will uncover every single thing about you, including, of course, any types of criminal activity that you may have had, expunged or otherwise. And one of the things that the bar does in this moral character review is compare what you said about yourself on your law school application to what they know at that point, because they've done the investigation, to be true. And so what has happened for, some unfortunate individuals out there is that there have sometimes been these determinations that the information has not been accurate. And that has led to some, thankfully just a few, some graduates of their law school actually being stripped of their law degree because their admissions offer, the thing that gave them entry in the first place, was rescinded. So that's a lot of heartache and a lot of stress and a lot of money for something that could have been avoided by just disclosing in the first place. Because the question then gets posed, would the admissions office have still admitted this person had they known the truth? And if the answer is determined, no, they wouldn't have, and then they rescind that offer, even 3 years down the line, retroactively, it can lead to a lot of problems. So it's very important to understand what you're being asked. I would ask you also to go the extra mile and give all the contextual information, the who, what, when, where, why, how, all of that stuff. Plus, hopefully you've learned a lesson and you can communicate that as well. So this is the same type of advice I would give for anything in the realm of the academic distress questions. If you've been on academic probation, just like people should get their credit report once a year to look and see what's on their credit report and make sure it's accurate, you should all have a copy of your undergraduate transcripts. You shouldn't be submitting anything to LSAC for law schools to be able to review that you don't know what it says. So sometimes there are erroneous errors. Well, sorry, that's redundant. There are some erroneous grades on your transcript, and you might need a little bit of time to work that out with your respective schools. So get a copy of your transcripts, even if they're unofficial. You don't have to pay for them for this exercise. And take a look. Make sure everything on the transcript is as you would expect it to be. Sometimes people are in a lot of distress because there are withdrawals on there that they didn't know of or they didn't remember. There was an academic probation. And if you might remember at the beginning of these slides, I mentioned on the CAS banner sheet, there's a section there about misconduct and irregularities. So if it's determined in the application review process that you did not answer a question truthfully, right? If there was academic probation on your transcript, but in the question you said no, that school has the discretion to submit an entire report with that information to LSAC for the subcommittee of misconduct and irregularity to review. And if it's determined that there was misconduct or irregularity, that will be on your permanent record. It will go out to every law school you have ever applied to or will apply to. And then you'll be in that really awkward position of trying to explain away something like that. So don't put yourself in that position. When in doubt, disclose, know what's there, and be very forthcoming. Okay, so we have we have a lot of other events coming up. So we do have one coming up this Monday. It's our Southwestern Spotlight with a 3L student, meaning she's in her last year. Her name is Rosemary. Hope you can join us for that. And then we have our Southwestern Law Day, which is going to have a panel of students and alums, as well as a mock class on November 7th. So that concludes my slides. We still have about 15 minutes for questions. So I'm going to just go to Nancy here. We can take some additional questions.
Hi, yes. Jeff B, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there. Thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. It's been extremely informational. And my question is regarding the disclosures of the things that the dean she was talking about. And I wanted to see if she could mention a few things that people usually don't think they should disclose, that they should disclose. Things that might look mild, like a ticket of something, whatever. So if you could give us some examples of what are the things that we should talk about and disclose, and in other words, like, for lack of a better term, like confess to you guys, that one would not necessarily think that, oh, I need to talk about this, please.
Well, I will say most people are pretty good about disclosing to us. And again, because our questions are really detailed. But I guess one thing that sometimes maybe I could imagine, I guess it's hard to know what what I don't know that people didn't submit. But maybe a question that people ask more frequently is if they were arrested but not charged with something, that can, I guess, maybe be a little bit ambiguous to people. I don't necessarily think it should, because we ask specifically if you've been arrested.
Maybe juvenile infractions, Lisa?
Maybe juvenile infractions, although I think we ask about that specifically too. Maybe there's some ambiguity about if the person has sealed records versus not. I don't think actually our question asks about sealed records. I know we specifically ask about things even if they were expunged, but do you know, Nancy, do we ask about sealed?
I don't know if the word sealed is necessarily in there, but in my mind, I group that along with expunged, even though they're technically different. But yeah. I think in general, it's best to disclose.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point you mentioned though about the juvenile, and our question has evolved over the years. It wasn't always this detailed. I do know of a particular case several years ago of one of our alums who did not disclose a juvenile, I can't even say infraction because it was actually fairly serious. And by the time he was done with the bar and he had actually passed the bar exam, but he had not cleared his moral character because he had not disclosed, he ended up having to hire an attorney, and it took him about an additional 1.5 years or 2 years to actually get his license. So I can't specifically speculate that had he disclosed to us that it wouldn't have still taken as long as it took, but I definitely think the fact that he didn't disclose it didn't help him. So maybe that would be an example, but when in doubt, truly just disclose. You're far better off doing so.
Okay. All right. Sorry, did you have a follow-up?
No, I was just saying thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Ron, go ahead. Ron Clancy, are you ready to ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute.
Question.
Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Right now, Ron is going to ask his question.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions with respect to the disclosures. I live in Ontario, Canada, and our process is a little bit different up here. So this is kind of new territory for me, because we do have the Ontario Bar Association that does this, does the checks, but they don't do it as part of the application. So I guess what I've heard with this webinar and the one I attended earlier today is that this is part of the application process in the US. Now, someone had mentioned that you need to get as specific as like traffic violations in your disclosures. Is that true?
That may be true at other schools. I can't speak to what all of the other schools might ask in their various jurisdictions. I know ours specifically says you do not have to include traffic violations if they are minor in nature. So for example, a speeding ticket, you do not. But if somebody was harmed because you had a speeding ticket, then there are most likely other charges. And then in that case, you would need to disclose. So there's some kind of fine lines there that you need to assess.
Right, okay, that makes sense. Now, I don't generally like getting into personal things in a large format, but
you certainly don't have to. You are welcome to.
No, simply because it might not apply to other people. But I did notice that you mentioned military charges. Now I have 20 years of service in the Canadian Forces, and in that time I have a summary charge for an absent without leave, and then I also have a court-martial where charges were withdrawn, and then I was acquitted of charges. Now that I would have to disclose as well?
Yes. Okay,
and would I send a copy of the court-martial report with that? Because that's available public information in Canada.
You know, if you have it, it probably wouldn't hurt. We generally don't ask for court documents, but for the cases where someone has a felony, and obviously I know your court-martial is different, but if you have them, it probably wouldn't hurt. So I would say go
Okay.
ahead and submit.
Yeah, because these aren't felony charges, like they're military charges. There's no
Right.
civilian equivalent. It was failure to follow a regulation.
Right. And you would definitely want to give the context to your situation. And if any lessons were learned, I would also encourage you to take that opportunity and discuss that too.
Okay. And to follow up on that, because I definitely would be taking the opportunity in an addendum to explain the many lessons learned from that process. Would this be an opportunity to say that this is part of what inspired me was working with the civilian attorney that I hired for this process?
Absolutely. Sure.
Okay. Great. That's everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron.
Okay, next up we have Angie, then we'll do Carolina, and then we have someone who wanted to ask a question they mentioned in chat, Javon. So we'll go in that order. Angie?
Hi, so in regards to disclosing, there was a civil suit filed on my behalf when I was like 5 because of an injury. Do I need to explain that it wasn't like on my behalf?
No, you don't have to.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. The more common civil suits that we would see are sometimes they are the result of traffic accidents. Sometimes they are employment law related or domestic issues, things like that. Those are some of the more common types of civil lawsuits that we see.
Okay, next, Carolina.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi.
I am an international applicant, and from what I have read about grade conversion tables on the LSAC website, my grades would convert to what is considered a bad GPA in the United States, but it is actually a good GPA in my country of origin. So should I write an addendum addressing this?
So yes, you probably should address anything that you don't feel like is going to otherwise be conveyed the same way. The foreign evaluation process that LSAC goes through with their third party does give us the equivalency, and then they kind of break down, you know, if it's, I forget the terminology, but if it's like, you know, excellent, good, fair, poor, something like that. So you should be able to get a copy of that, I believe, on your profile, so you can see how their particular third party assesses your performance. But if you feel like it's underscoring, then yes, you can certainly take the opportunity in an addendum.
Perfect, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then Javon, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Thank you for taking my question. I understand that there's rolling admissions and we are advised to apply as early as possible. One, will there ever be a scenario in which you make all of the decisions, let's say, when people are still applying? And then two, if so, how can we find out if you're at capacity before our application is submitted?
I'm not sure I understand fully the first part of your question. So let me answer the last part first. We're never really at capacity until the very, very, very end of the cycle.
Okay.
So if you're interested in our scale program, which starts in June, I would say the end for them is probably mid-May. And if you're interested in our traditional or part-time programs that start in early August, I would say similarly, the end is going to be like mid-July. That's when it gets to be really, really finite decisions that we're making. We might only take one or two after that period. So the first part of your question, can you elaborate on that for me?
Well, you may have answered it because I was concerned about rolling admissions. Let's say there were 80 people on this call, everyone's stellar, everyone gets in when they apply, and then because there are so many spaces. So just wondering if you ever...
The other way to look at it all is, you know, you can take a look, our entering class, you know, we had about 1,900 applications. We admitted a little less than 900 of them. And then we had not quite 340 students. So obviously, not everybody we admit comes. So that's part of why there is the rolling process, because, you know, when we start admitting, usually around Thanksgiving, it's like we're just admitting blindly until we get to seat deposits, which is April. So in that whole window, I have no idea, you know, if I'm just casting out offers into the wind, you know, other than people saying, you know, in an individual capacity, oh, Southwestern's my first choice, or this is exactly where I want to go. Other than that kind of really specific feedback from applicants, I don't know, and no school does. That's why we have things like seat deposits, because, you know, it does force the student to commit financially, which, you know, isn't for us to make money because it just goes towards tuition, but it allows us to really gauge that one individual's interest in our school. And chances are, if somebody has no interest in us, they're not going to spend any amount of money, right? And so what you may see, though, I answered the question about sort of when is the end. But what you wouldn't necessarily know, but what we observe is that there are waves. So we are making a lot of offers, admission and scholarship, you know, earlier in the process, getting those really strong offers out to the best applicants that we have who've already applied. Then as we get closer to the seat deposits, or after we see the results of our first rounds of seat deposits, we may slow down. It doesn't mean stop, but we might slow down because we also don't want to over-enroll a class and not have capacity for them. So, you know, it kind of is like a roller coaster, right? It kind of like tick, 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 ticks, and then it kind of goes down and it might go up again. It's there. That's essentially the rolling. That's why we use that terminology. So hopefully that answers your question. And I think, unless there's a really, really short question, I think we are just about ready to segue over to the blueprint portion of tonight. Is there one other really short question that somebody wants to ask? I'm gonna switch over. Okay. Are we ready to go over into the blueprint section?
I believe I saw Robert. Robert, you're here?
Yep, all set if we're good to go.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. Robert, you should have the ability to share your screen.
All right, let's see.
Oh, maybe you need to be, hold on.
I think I'm a co-host here. I think I can click.
Yeah.
All right, folks, is everybody able to see just fine here? Give me a thumbs up. All set? Fantastic. Let's see. So my name is Robert. I've been teaching the LSAT for Blueprint since 2013 when I took the October exam. I took it one time. I got a 174, a score I was pretty happy with. It was actually an exactly 11-point increase from my 163 diagnostic test. Blueprint happens to have an average of 11-point increase, which we're really proud of. And so I happen to fall exactly into that 11-point pattern there. I think I kind of enjoy the whole test, just kind of a nerd, I suppose, about it. I think a lot of folks will tell you that logic games is the most intimidating, but a lot of folks will also tell you it can be the most fun. Like if you're the type of person who likes to do Sudoku or something like that, then you might enjoy logic games. It's a game. But I think my favorite most of all is logical reasoning. I like logical reasoning because it feels the most lawyerly. It's you're evaluating a short argument in the majority of cases, and you're trying to point to a flaw in the reasoning, or you're trying to strengthen it, or weaken it, as if it was maybe your client or opposing counsel. So it gives you a lot of opportunity to argue. So I think I found that the most enjoyable. As you guys are probably all aware, the LSAT is changing a lot. And it was changing a lot even before everything, you know, COVID, et cetera, started to impact our daily lives. But now that's a big point of emphasis as well. Previously, they'd started to move towards, you know, a tablet format. As many of you guys are probably aware, I think that was starting in June of last year. But now, ever since March, of course, we've been having to administer the LSAT in a at-home format. So as you guys can see here, we have what's called the Lsat Flex. And I don't know how long they're going to be keeping that name, because it's starting to really feel like the new normal. You know, you hear that phrase all the time, but I think when it comes to the LSAT, we're going to be approaching, we're going to be doing Lsat Flex exams for a full year at least, because it was just announced today that the January, the February, and the April exams are all also going to be in the Flex format. So big change, big change. And that's this point here, future dates subject to change. It's just not updated as of today when we got this new information here. So it looks like if you guys are planning on taking it, certainly anytime coming up towards April, but I think probably relatively safe to expect even perhaps on through the summer of 2021, if not longer, they will be an online flexed exam. So what does the flex exam entail exactly? I think there's different schools of thought here, but I think it's a pretty big jump. I'd be curious actually to hear the weigh-ins from the deans of admissions here about how, if you guys are viewing it at all different. But I think it's interesting. It's a bit of a different beast. If you guys had any thoughts there.
Sure. Well, we've been told by LSAC that we are to treat it the same, and that it is the same. That being said, anecdotally, I am seeing some people scoring quite a bit higher on the flex than if they had a previous non-flex administration. I don't know if that's because it's shorter, or if they're more at ease at home, or because they're by themselves. You know, I don't know, but anecdotally, it seems like some people might be doing a little bit better, but we are treating it exactly the same in all the same ways that we used the LSAT previously.
Definitely. That's consistent with what I've observed as well. It's interesting because I think on an objective level, the flex exam is easier in the sense that it's shorter. Previously, students were taking a 5-section exam, and that was really taxing. If any of you guys have tried 5-section exams, I mean, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint by any stretch of the imagination. It's a marathon. It's the type of exam where, you know, you want to be giving 100% throughout, certainly, but you actually have to kind of calculate on early sections 1 and 2, like I need to kind of retain a little energy, a little strength for sections 4 and 5 when I'm really pushing, and there would be a break in between. The flex exam is very different. It is still going to be this exact same type of LSAT questions, and that is, as you can see on the 4th bullet point here, reading comprehension, which is a long passage, and you analyze some questions about that passage, usually like 6 or so. Analytical reasoning or logical reasoning, which was what I said is my favorite. It's the short arguments, and you analyze those. I'm sorry, analytical reasoning, which is the logic games, rather. The games, which are kind of fun, a little bit like Sudoku. And then the logical reasoning, which is my personal favorite, where you are doing the little argument. So it's the exact same here, but the difference is instead of 5 sections, you're now doing only 3. And I think that makes it it's not really a marathon any longer. There's no break. It's just 3 35-minute sections. So you're looking at 115 or 105 minutes instead of what approaches a 3-hour process when you include the breaks. So that's very different, I think. There's also been big changes to the writing portion of the exam. The writing portion of the exam used to be done right after the course. So we would tell students, you know, it's like when your coach tells you to go jog a cool down lap, you know, just kind of take it easy, make sure you're making reasoned arguments and being thoughtful, but it's not scored. It's a little bit different. We've been advised, and I'm sure the Dean of Admissions could corroborate here, that the LSAC has suggested that in some cases admissions might be looking a little bit more into the writing portion than they did in the past, because students have the opportunity to take it home and take it a little bit more seriously, not take it while they're fatigued after a previous exam.
Well, definitely, I think applicants are being advised to take it more seriously, just generally speaking. I've heard people be told before that nobody ever read it, so it didn't matter what they put on there. And the result of that showed people would draw pictures and write jokes and write their own like version of their letter of recommendation for themselves about themselves. I mean, just generally weird things. But, you know, I think it kind of cuts both ways. So because students do have a little bit longer time to write this writing sample, in that, you know, it's not with all the fatigue of the test itself, and they can kind of have a little bit of time to recover, you know, it kind of takes a little bit of the fun away of the pressured writing exam that it was before. But I mean, we always encourage people to take it seriously, as they should every other part of their application.
Definitely. Yeah, I could see anything that we could safely describe as silliness. Probably not a good tactic for any component of an application, no.
Never stand out for the wrong reasons.
For the wrong reasons, definitely. The last major point, folks, I'd like to point out of a difference with this flex examination, I think this one's the most interesting, is that previously it would be 5 sections where one is the experimental, and the experimental the LSAC would use to try to test out new questions or new games or new passages. They wanted to make sure that they weren't confusing students, so they didn't want anomalous results like, wow, most students don't get this, so clearly we didn't write a very good question, kind of thing. Now they're scrambling, and we don't have an experimental section, which is kind of nice. It's a little bit shorter. But you also don't have the second logical reasoning section, which was a major feature of the previous exam, because you would have 4 scored sections, 1 game, 1 reading, and 2 logical reasoning. And that made it so that logical reasoning, analyzing these small arguments, was it was technically the majority of the exam. It was about 51 or 52% of the exam, you know, 226 question sections out of about 100 or 101. Now it's relegated to being about 34% of the exam. It's, you know, 26 questions out of about 75 questions. And so that's a big change. Commensurately, reading comp now has an outsized impact. Instead of just being 25% of your test, it's up to 33% of your test. And logic games has an outsized impact. Instead of being 25, it's also 33%. So everything's very even now. So for some students for whom, you know, logic games was really tough, or man, I could never read fast enough to get through reading comp, the flex can be a little bit of a disadvantage, because now it's 1/3 of the exam rather than just 1/4 of the exam. Any questions there? I think I can address here, folks, at this time. Okay. Moving to the Lsat Basics, it's the law school admissions test. I'm sure you're all aware it's administered by the Law School Admissions Council. I always think it's a bit of an interesting relationship. I think sometimes students think that, you know, Blueprint is administering the exam. Blueprint, you know, test masters, PowerScore are our peers as well. They're all test prep companies designed to teach you how to approach the exam the most effectively. And so we're scrambling as much as some students and some admission staffs are as well, to try to make it adjustments, as we see a lot of big changes coming through, both the LSAC making choices on their own and also having to make different choices as a result of coronavirus. So there's some, you know, some learning curve for all of us to this, but it's been an interesting time. Previously, they'd moved to taking them on Microsoft Surface tablets. Now, of course, as we discussed, they're being taken at home. Lsat Basics, I think most of you guys probably are not registered for an Lsat exam yet, which is perfectly fine. How do you register? You go to the LSAC. You're going to need to make an account. It's a relatively expensive exam. It's $200, and they're also making new changes about abilities to cancel with payment and things like that. So applying to law school and registering for the Lsat comes up to be quite a challenging toll for some folks. And I do think it's important to bear that in mind. It's important to bear in mind, you know, how much not only will I spend on applying or taking the Lsat, but also applying to schools down the line. I've had some students I've worked with who tell me, you know, I'd love to apply to more than 4 schools. I want to cast a broad net, but I might not have the financial resources. So bearing that in mind early is important. Sometimes it becomes roughly around $100 per application. So something to bear in mind there. Who can take the Lsat? Anybody. It's not the case. I hear this misunderstood often. It's not the case that you need to complete your undergrad first. I took it, for example, my junior year of college. What's on the Lsat? As we discussed, it's 5 35-minute sections typically, where only 4 of them are scored, or 6 if you're counting the writing sample. So 6 if you're counting the writing sample, where 4 of them are scored. And as we discussed, the writing sample is now take home. You're going to do 2 logical reasonings historically, 1 reading comp and 1 game. Then you'd also do the 1 unscored experimental section. You wouldn't know what that is. It could be games, reading comp, or LR. And then you would do the unscored writing portion. Now we're doing it at home. So as you can see here, your scored portions, your unscored portions, games, LR times 2 historically, and 1 reading comp section, and a concerned student here, as you can see. How's it scored? You're gonna get 3 scores. One of them is your raw score. That'll just be, for example, 65 out of 100 or 85 out of 101. Then you'll get your percentile score, the percentage of other people that you topped, and then the score that most people talk about, the score that's most germane to your consideration here, is the scaled score, and that's a 120 to a 180. That's how you're probably hearing about this the most. It's scored on a curve. That should be some solace for students who walk out of an exam and they think to themselves, wow, that was really hard. The benefit there is it was really hard for everybody. If it was harder than the other exams you've taken because of a very difficult game, for example, or like a really challenging, perhaps science-oriented reading comp passage that was unfamiliar, it was that difficult for everyone. Unfortunately, on the flip side, if you say, wow, that was nice, there was no really tough game, there was no tough reading comprehension, then again, because it is scaled, then it's a little bit easier for everybody. So your score is always going to be considered relative to the people you took it with. A lot of students ask, what's a good score on the LSAT, or what's a passing score? It depends which schools you're applying to. It depends which schools you're applying to. Yale, for example, I think their median LSAT score is a 173. 173 for Yale Law School, which by a lot of metrics is the #1 law school in the country. That's real tough, and that's their median LSAT score. 50% of people are getting a higher score than that. So that's one frame of reference, and there's many other schools where that's absolutely not the case. But it very much depends, and I'd encourage you guys even now to try to maybe set up a list of your top couple law schools and see what they're expecting. You know, if you're really excited about UCLA, for example, if you're really excited about Southwestern, then go and look at their 25th, 50th, 75th percentiles, both for the LSAT and also for GPA, and you can start to get a little bit of a frame of reference. I know for my part, I was at Berkeley for undergrad. I kind of had a couple law schools in mind that I really wanted to target. And I started to just look at my GPA and my LSAT scores like, I have to attain these. And I was just constantly working towards that. And I felt like it was really helpful for me to have that like brass ring to try to always reach for. So that might be helpful for some of you as well. As we discussed here, your raw score is going to produce a percentile, and based on the percentile, they'll put you anywhere from a 120 to a 180, where of course the middle there is a 150. I think the bell curve ends up coming out around a 152 actually in most cases, but they pursue a 150. Here's your score conversion chart. This is just from one LSAT administration, the June 2015 administration, where if you wanted to get a 180 on the exam, you know, top score, you could miss 0, of course, or 1 or 2 actually. 98s to 100 all received a 180. 98s to 100 all received a 180. I think that there was a funny case actually, maybe one of you guys might recall, of the New York State Attorney General, Eliot Spitzer, who got involved in a few scandals. But one of them was, I remember he was going around bragging about a perfect LSAT score, and then there was some kind of like investigating, and he had got a perfect score. He'd got a 180, but he'd like missed 2. So technically he was not lying. He had got his 180, but it wasn't a perfect score in the sense that he missed any. Then he ended up in much more salacious scandals as well following that. In this case, a lot of students use 170 as a metric. That can be a good range to be looking into. Sometimes people talk about like T14 schools, and a 170 is kind of regarded as unlocking T14 schools. In this case, for this particular exam, in order to get a 170, you had to miss no fewer than 10. You had to get 90 out of 100 questions correct. And it all varies a little bit, but usually roughly -9 or -10 historically has been the benchmark. Now that we're looking at flex exams with no longer 100 questions and instead only about like 75 questions, instead of -9, it's a little bit of a black box because the LSAC isn't revealing everything, but I think we can safely say instead of roughly -9, we're looking at roughly -7 as earning you a 170. Questions there at all, folks? I know that's a lot of adjusting there.
I do have a question, particularly about the LSAT Flex, because while I understand it's different, I just want to get some thoughts around taking that. So I don't know if I'm jumping ahead.
No, by all means. It's probably the most pertinent question on the table right now. So ask away.
Well, I understand that, you know, the scoring is high because it's less sections. Are there any metrics about how people have performed on that so far, or is it just too new?
In part, it is both too new, number one, and number two, it's also very hard to say because the LSAC is deliberately not sharing that information with us. In the past, students would get score reports, we would get more information, and obviously it was a different format. And that's not the case anymore. So we're not getting access to the same conversion charts, et cetera. So it's a little bit challenging to say. Are students performing better? The thing with that is, as we discussed, because it's a scaled exam, if students are doing better, then what that ends up meaning is that you can only miss 6 or 5 even perhaps to get a 170. So if they administered a really simple exam, it would be tough. You'd have a much less significant margin for error to get the same score. So I'm not noticing students doing better necessarily, maybe better on their raw, but that would be washed out in their scaled score. Does that make sense? It's a tough one. I'm sure that's not a perfectly satisfactory answer. I will say this, in terms of like personal drain, in terms of fatigue, this is an easier exam because instead of taking 125 questions, 5 different sections, and taking almost 3 hours to do it, you're now only taking 3 sections and 75 questions. So in that respect, it's a little bit simpler now. Does that make sense? Perfect. When can I take the LSAT? It's now offered 9 times a year. That's a big change from the past where it used to be only 4 times a year. And how many times can I take it? 3 times in a single testing year. They try to drive that down a little bit. 5 times within current and past 5 testing years. That's actually a little bit more generous too. I think it used to be only allowed to take it 3 times within a span of 3 years up until about 2 years ago. So it's a big adjustment there.
Robert, can I chime in here?
Please do, yeah.
So what Robert is showing obviously are your limitations, not suggestions.
Right.
So just because there are allowances that include up to 7 times in the lifetime span, do not actually take the test 7 times. That is not a recommendation. I cannot say that more times. You should plan to take the test once. That should be your goal.
Mm-hmm.
It's expensive, it's stressful, it takes a lot of time, right? That should be your goal. That obviously isn't always the case, and many people do take it more than once. But there's a big difference between taking the test, 2 times, or maybe even as a stretch 3 times, and then all the way down to 5, 6, and 7. So if you are a person who has taken the test that many times, I would definitely suggest you write an addendum and include that in your application to address why you're taking the test that many times. Similarly, if you're experiencing big jumps in your score, or if you've had some decreases in your scores over multiple exams, also take the opportunity to address that as well. It can be something just as simple as you took a test prep company, right? Maybe you signed up with Blueprint for your second test and your scores went up a lot. It can be just that simple. And again, you don't have to worry about it being an excuse. Just give us some context. But sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just want to underscore that this is not a recommendation.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, these are the limits. You put it well. I heard it phrased in a way I liked once that taking the LSAT's a little bit like getting married. Can you do it more than once? Yes, but it's not ideal. And I think
also that's stressful and expensive.
Yeah, also stressful and expensive. Exactly. So definitely preferable to take it the one time. I definitely echo that. I always encourage students as well, if you do not get the score you're happy with, if you find yourself in that position, take it again because it's a very big part of most admissions processes. So in that case, one might arrive at a point where it becomes necessary, but absolutely you should be taking it with the intent that it be your only time. And actually, I want to only add to the emphasis to say, I recently, as of the last, I'd be curious if you guys have heard this as well in admissions, but in the last maybe 9 months or so, I've heard a lot of folks say, I'm planning to take the LSAT on this date and then again on this date. And I ask students sometimes, like, do you not think you'll be prepared within the 3 months, like for the first time, or like what's kind of the rationale there? Some students perhaps, are very given to test taking anxiety, and I've heard that as an explanation. But sometimes what I hear back is like, well, shouldn't I plan to take it twice? Like, don't you have to take this exam 2 times? And I think that that's really an important rumor to dispel. And I think it's very effective.
We see and hear similar. I ask the same question sometimes too. I do think it's okay. I guess the nuance that I would add to that is I do think it's okay to have multiple tests that you've registered for, which doesn't necessarily mean to me that you intend to sit for. You may just want to have a registration in your back pocket just in case, and you don't want to miss a window to register. You know, or now students are experiencing, you know, obviously everything is online and it's only tech-based, and, you know, if for some reason there is a challenge, you know, and you can't complete the test or start the test or what have you, then having another registration may actually be a really great, you know, strategy point. But again, that's not the same thing to me as, oh, I'm going to take the test in November and I'm going to take the test in January. You know, to purposefully plan to take it more than once, I don't think is a good idea, for many reasons. But I think people have that carryover mentality of like, I'll take it just to try it out. I'll just see how I do. I think people often think of things like that, of a lot of tests like that. People even think of the bar exam like that, which sounds ludicrous to me personally. But
you know, money and time,
and stress and all of the things. Yes. So I think, I don't know. I wish people didn't always, or didn't a lot of times see it that way, but many people do. I don't think it's an anomaly what you've experienced, Robert.
Yeah. I tentatively blame Reddit. I think
we can blame Reddit for a lot of things.
For a lot of things. Yeah.
There's a lot of liars on Reddit.
Yeah. And man, that's again, as we talk about ways to avoid stress, there's I think something to be said for maybe some of you guys have already delved into top law schools or Reddit blogs, et cetera. And there's something to be said for community. And I know I delved in a little bit when I was studying for the LSAT, when I was taking my applications in and everything. But there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it'll just turn you into a basket case, like the amount of stress it induces. I think there's something to be said for perhaps steering clear there. A last question on this slide, folks. Is there any easier LSAT to take? No, I think that some students try to scheme it like, you know, this was a tough one, people are retaking. I think set that aside. I don't think there's any way to accurately predict this stuff. I think there's a lot more noise than signal when you're trying to make these kind of predictions. The only thing that you can really control is, do I know exactly how to handle logic games? Do I have a clear method to quickly work through reading comp every time? Do I know how to address each and every LR question? That should be your focus. Next here, LSAT dates that are coming up. We've got beginning here with November 14th. That one, of course, is already been signed up for. The registration period has closed for the November 14th exam. But for anybody who is looking in the coming weeks to be looking towards an exam, January, February, and April are the next dates approaching. There's no December test. There's no March test either, as you can see. And again, as of today, it's been announced that each of those are going to be administered from home. I think an important consideration there, by the way, class, is because the LSAC administers the tests nationwide and they compare your scores against student scores nationwide, they're in a position where they can't have, let's say that the last COVID hotspot is Florida, because Florida. And if that is the case, then they can't have the rest of the country doing it in classrooms and then Florida doing it from home because of the potential like comparisons, the difference in the environment, et cetera, whether that's for good or for bad, you know, taking it at home. So the LSAC is kind of in a position where until they can guarantee that it'll be safe to do everywhere nationwide, in classrooms, we're going to be stuck with this flex format for a while. So I think even as we look towards the possibility of a vaccine, perhaps early in 2020, getting approved and administered through the middle part of 2021, rather 2021, I wouldn't be surprised if it's not until the fall at the earliest that we start to see us moving off of the flex exam. Is that consistent more or less with what you guys are hearing in admissions here?
Yes. And also, we're not talking about this specifically, but I just want to give a plug with LSAC resources.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody is nervous about the technology you have or your equipment and taking the flex, they do have some loaner laptops that they are shipping to candidates. So there's a whole process, of course, to qualify for that. But I think they have 1,500 that they have at their disposal. So if you do find yourself in that particular predicament, you know, don't hesitate to reach out and see if that's an option for you.
Yeah, an excellent point. Really important to kind of practice how you're going to play. That goes for everybody. Make sure that you're taking exams in the format that they'll be administering it. I'm someone who prefers paper. Like, I prefer my books paper rather than Kindle, and I'd rather take a paper exam than an online exam. Fortunately, it's no longer an option, and it's really because I prefer the paper most of all that it's important for someone like me to try to get accustomed to like this new and slightly more annoying, candidly, format that we're using. Okay, let's talk games briefly. There's 4 games in every case, not roughly. And they do seem scary. I remember I came out of my first diagnostic exam, and I told my friends, like, I'm never going to get good at these games. This is not the type of thing that I'm good at. You know, it's just too many things, too many variables to keep track of. I felt like I needed like an abacus where I could like move different pieces, different places to keep track of them. It's like trying to come up with the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle without the Pythagorean theorem compared to trying to do it once you've been given the Pythagorean theorem. Once you get a method together, these become a lot easier. And I tell all of my students that the realistic expectation for my high achievers is -0 on games. That's not probably realistic for reading comp, probably not realistic for LR either, but for games, achievable for all high achieving students, -0 or -1 perhaps, but really high game scores because it's the most learnable. We've really got a formula there. And as you see at the bottom, a lot of people end up thinking that they're pretty fun. A typical game looks a little bit like this. We won't go all the way through it, but just to give you an idea. A company employee generates a series of 5-digit product codes in accordance with the following rules. The codes use the digits 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and no other digits. Those are our players in the game. Each digit occurs exactly once in any code. You won't see 1, 1, or 2, 2, or 3, 3. They occur only once. The second digit has a value exactly twice that of the first digit. So if you have 1 in slot 1, then you've got to have 2 in slot 2. If you have 2, then you have to have 4, et cetera, et cetera. The value of the third digit is less than the value of the 5th digit. Whatever goes into slot 3 has to be smaller than what you've got in the 4th slot. This is a pretty typical game. This is what they'll often look like. It's going to be a series of players, and you're going to be organizing them in some sense or another. At this stage, it might be a little bit complicated, but what we'll do is we'll set up a series of rules, just like this. We've got our players 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then we've got number 2, number 3, and number 4 all listed here to make it a little bit more comfortable. Then we'll come up with deductions. You see it on the left side of the screen here. Rule number 3 tells us that slots 1 and 2 must be digits 1 and 2, or else digits 2 and 4, because that's the only way to accommodate the rule that says the second digit has a value exactly twice that of the first digit. So we'll want to make sure to take that into account. Since there's only 2 different ways this game can go, either 1 and 2 or 2 and 4, then we're going to consider doing scenarios. We've got scenarios here. In scenario number 1, I know this gets a little bit muddy here, my apologies. In scenario 1, we contemplate if we have 1 and 2, and we see that we have to have this type of a result. And in our second scenario, we have 2 and 4, and then we start to see what kind of possibilities, what kind of combinations are possible there. And then to get a little bit of an idea of the questions, you'll have the questions that hopefully will be answerable very easily in our scenarios. So the first one is, if the last digit of an acceptable product code is 1, then it must be true that blank. And what we know here is we have to consider that the value of the third digit is less than the value of the fifth digit. So if we're told that the last digit is 1, then the first digit has to be in accord, or the third digit rather has to be in accord with that. So we've got other questions like this: which one of the following must be true about any acceptable product code? So we're going to think about what's universally true. We've got 3, a conditional question. Under the circumstances where the third digit is something other than 0, then what else has to be the case? And we'll contemplate there. Any questions on these games? Typically, like I said, there's going to be 4 in this case, or 6, or in this case, 5 questions based off of it. Any questions on these? Hopefully you can see how at a certain point, once you get familiar, these start to be kind of fun. Let's turn to logical reasoning. Again, historically, there used to be 2 sections. Pretty good odds that you're going to be taking the Flex exam and you will only have 1 question. You'll have anywhere from 24 to 26. I usually see the higher range there, 25 or 26 questions on these. And that's why sometimes you'd see around 51%, because 51 out of 100 questions would be LR. You read a short passage. It's not oriented towards like memorizing the content. It's much more oriented towards assessing the argument that's presented, or coming up with a viable conclusion. So for example, you might have something like this that says some planning committee members, those representing the construction industry, have significant financial interest in the committee's decisions. No one who is in the planning committee lives in the suburbs, although many of them do work there in the suburbs. So what I want to do, class, is give you guys a moment to work through this individually as you guys are in your workspace. You might want to pull out a piece of scratch paper, could be helpful. And take a minute to assess what we can safely conclude here. And I think the chat function is open, correct?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. I'd love to hear back. I'll give you guys a little bit of time to assess here. About, say, another 75 seconds or so. Let's start to see some answers coming in here. All right, folks, so let's pull it together. Let's pick an answer choice if you haven't already. We're told that some planning committee members, those who represent the construction industry, do have significant financial interests in the committee's decisions. No one who is on the planning committee lives in the suburbs, although many of them do work in the suburbs. If the statements above are true, then what has to be true on that basis? And what has to be true is that some people with significant financial interest in the planning committee's decisions do not live in the suburbs. Why? Because as we're told above, so that's answer choice E, as we're told above, some planning committee members have significant financial interests. And we're told that no one on the planning committee lives in the burbs, although some do work there. If you combine these two terms, we can safely conclude that some persons with significant financial interests do not live in the suburbs. It's working through the process by a sequence of it's called transitive logic, deductive logic. And if any of you guys have taken maybe a computer programming class or a philosophy of logic class, this may look a little bit familiar to you. often helps to map these through. And that's a lot of what logical reasoning involves there. Coming up with what must be true, what can be concluded from an argument, or otherwise coming up with a flaw in the reasoning or how to improve a given argument. And lastly, we've got reading comp. You've got roughly 26, 27 questions in 4 different passages. You read, it's a shortish passage. It's like, it's maybe 1 column. If you could fit two columns on a page, it's like 1 column long. So it's substantial. And you've probably seen this on other standardized tests. For most students, this feels really comfortable at the beginning relative to the other sections. RC is a glimpse into law school life. I think that's pretty fair. You're going to be doing a lot of reading in law school, a lot of reading. And this is a good little way to kind of segue into that field. Many of them will ask you to synthesize more than 1 passage. Those are called comparative passages, and you'll compare the two's relationships. Start signing up for grown-up magazines of a certain varietal, as noted here. In newspapers now, for my part, personally, I recommend, I'd be curious other people's weigh-ins here as well, but I recommend The Atlantic. Publishes a lot of free content, and it's written in a format kind of like reading comprehension. I would say The Economist is also a pretty good one, writes at a similar type of level. Scientific American is a really good one. Those are 3 publications, The Atlantic, The Economist, and Scientific American. They each, I think, can give you a pretty good idea of what the style of reading comp passages are. And I think it's good to start to get into that, kind of professional writing, if that's not something you're super familiar with, maybe because you're a math major, because I think you'll end up seeing a lot of that both on the LSAT and then into law school. Once you're done with the exam, all 3 sections, you're taking the writing sample. This is going to be done at home. Whether it's Flex or not, it's going to be done at home. It is unscored, but as we discussed, do not blow it off because it's something that's going to be read by the admissions team. Do not draw pictures unless you're like a fantastic artist. I don't know if maybe that might allow some kind of exception, but you do not want to be drawing pictures on this. You want to be taking it seriously. From what I understand, the most important thing is to demonstrate rather that you can write clearly and thoughtfully. It's not ever going to be a situation where there's a correct answer for the prompt that you're asked to respond to. I think in my case, when I took the exam in October 2013, my question was, Dolly has 2 options. She's a musician, and she can either be the opening act in a big nationwide tour, or she can be the main act in a more regional tour. And she has certain interests that might steer her towards a national tour, like getting exposure, but she has other interests, like being close to her studio, that might steer her towards a regional tour. What the LSAC and admissions want to see is that you're able to thoughtfully evaluate these. You're not dismissing one side. You're not brushing one side under the rug. You're weighing the pros and cons, and you come to a thoughtful determination. No correct answer, but you want to show that you have those skills. Anything to add there from admissions? Perfect.
Nope, that covers it.
Excellent. LSAC will be recording you the entire time. No cheating. Now's a good time as you guys make your law school journey to as I'm sure you already are, to walk the straight and narrow. You'll be recorded kind of 2-way camera the entire time. Maybe some of you guys who are still in undergrad are already experiencing exams taken that way, but the bar exams that are being administered in most states are also done that way now. They're from home. They're recorded the entire time, and I think like a proctor reviews you partially in real time, and then they'll review you again later. There's some automated technology that identifies anything that looks odd. So it's definitely something to be mindful of. Choosing an LSAT date. I think when it comes to choosing an LSAT date, it would be great to work backwards from, the optimal time for you to apply. And that would be the ideal circumstances. But what has to be a constraining principle there is, when can I be ready? When can I be ready? As we discussed, you do not want to take the LSAT more times than necessary. Students, some students who give themselves like 4 or 5 weeks are going to be disappointed. This is a very tough exam to learn in that amount of time. I think I would say 6 at a bare minimum. And I would say most students should be planning for 8 weeks at minimum of study for this exam. I know for my part, I found it useful to study on more like a 12-week time scale. What I really liked about that is I think learning the LSAT involves so much like logic and deductive logic, and you really have to kind of shift how your brain thinks a little bit, that it becomes a little bit like learning a language. And for some of you guys who maybe like, you know, just took Spanish in high school, like I did, you know, I'm not bilingual, but I think even taking, you know, going up to Spanish 3 in high school, it was helpful for me at a certain point where I stopped translating every single word like to English that I was hearing and started to get comfortable thinking in Spanish, you know, to a mild degree with Spanish 3. That's how the LSAT's going to look as well. For a long time, you're going to be translating each and everything like, okay, well, what does that, like, how do I make this make sense? At a certain point, you transcend that and it starts being comfortable to think in these logical terms. And that's when you know you're ready. In most cases, that's when you know you're ready. And that takes a little bit of time. Simple truth, kind of a reiteration of what I just articulated. The best date to take the LSAT is the date that's going to give you enough time to prep. No matter what that date looks like for you, you know, whether you have to cancel a vacation, or even potentially if that means you might have to push yourself back to a different admission cycle, you know, push that back a year. You want to be taking a test that puts you in a good position to succeed. I won't speak for admissions here, but I think that the conventional wisdom is that the LSAT for most schools is the single most important part of the application package. If you had to point to a single one, not necessarily to say the majority, but probably the plurality for many schools. I'd be curious to hear a weigh in there, but that's definitely is an important part. I
think it's definitely a really important part. I think any school that tells you otherwise is not being truthful. Mm-hmm. For us specifically, I guess I would also add in, it's the combination of the LSAT score and the undergraduate GPA. Mm-hmm. Those two quantitative factors are the most important things in the file. Mm-hmm. But that being said, many people have the same LSAT and GPA combinations or very close to. And so that's where the other aspects of your application, you know, really allow one person to stand out compared to another. But if I had to wager between LSAT and GPA, I think there was a little bit more weight given to the LSAT. Partially that's really because of how the GPA is, right? The GPA is derived from many different grades over many different years, over many different institutions. So there is not as much consistency when looking at one person's GPA versus another person's GPA. The LSAT's a little bit more normalized. Everybody's pretty much taking the same test over a relatively same experience. Plus the LSAT has a little bit more of a correlation to first-year law school performance. Mm-hmm. Which ultimately then first-year law school performance has a correlation to bar success. So, you know, we make some big leaps there, and that is by no means to say if you don't get in the very upper ranges on the LSAT, you're not going to do well in law school, because people obviously do. But there are some statistical correlations that we have information for that kind of lead us down that path. So I would say that's a fairly accurate assessment that the LSAT is slightly more important.
Right. And I think we could probably safely say for maybe all schools, maybe with no exceptions, those two quantitative factors typically are, you can't overstate the importance there. Get your A's, folks, and then get your 180s. It's a numbers game to a substantial extent. Certainly not completely, but got to get the grades. Got to get the grades. All right, folks, in terms of LSAT prep then, now, you know, with some familiarity of the exam itself, I've been teaching classroom courses since I took the LSAT, and I really enjoy it. You know, there's not much. I teach college courses as well, and there is not much you can point to where you see such a striking difference. I think a lot of students go into this exam just utterly confused, and seeing them walk out, I think, is really rewarding. I really enjoy the classroom experience. You get to actually meet people. Of course, for the foreseeable future, probably, you know, again, into probably on into the summer, not to speak completely for Blueprint, but I think on into the summer, it's very unlikely that we're able to see these kind of in-person classes. So that takes us instead to online, which could involve on-demand videos that you can watch in your own time. But there's also new formats called the hybrid courses, which Blueprint calls our live online courses, where you have live instruction. It's actually a little bit similar to this. We'll proceed via Zoom. We'll have an interactive session. There's also a TA who can respond to questions in real time so that the instructor isn't always being interrupted. And it's all online. It's essentially live streamed. And I think it's a really valuable way to kind of replicate that in-person classroom experience. We also offer tutoring. I think for a lot of students who maybe, you know, logic games is really tough for me, or for people who just need that individualized care, tutoring can be a great option. And I think all of those are well worth considering. I'll speak for a moment to why Blueprint. I think that there's a few good test prep companies out there. There's some that I think a little bit less of, but I'm really proud to work for Blueprint. As I mentioned, we're really proud of our 11-point average score increase. And you can see some testimonials here from people who've made big jumps. You know, this gentleman here from a 157 to a 171, that's really changing the landscape of the type of schools that he's going to be looking into. And I think Blueprint, you know, in terms of what makes it unique relative to some of its other peers, you know, I think Testmasters, PowerScore, these companies deliver quality products, which are in many respects relatively similar to Blueprints. But I think what makes us stand out is we very deliberately try to cultivate an entertaining environment. This is a grueling exam. It's a grueling logic-based exam. And if you aren't able to resonate with an instructor, to like chuckle a little bit over the course of this, if you're expected to study for 2 hours a day or do 3-hour classroom, you know, Zoom classroom meetings, where it's not engaging, then I think that that's tough for a lot of students. So that's something we really strive for. I also really encourage you guys to look at our online materials. I think that they're as advanced and as thorough as you'll find anywhere in the business. So that's a couple of things that I think set us apart. We've been doing Flex crash courses as well with one of our veteran instructors, Ross Reinhardt. If that is something that you could be interested in, then I definitely encourage you to check it out. It's a way for you to get caught up on the LSAT, you know, if you realize that your test date is fast approaching. Lately, we've been really impressed with our live online programs. That's one of the things that we're pushing the most right now, because previously we loved classroom courses, and this is the closest that we can do to replicate it, you know, during these odd times. You're going to have a expert instructor with 98th percentile plus scores, and you get access to the anytime course as well. So if you are unable at any point to make it to one of our meetings, then you'll always be able to catch up there, which is kind of nice for people who have a little bit more of a challenging schedule, be it with children or with you know, other obligations with work, et cetera, et cetera. Our online anytime course is not the live program. That's where, you know, you hop on whenever it is you're available. Again, that can be nice for people who have more challenging schedules. Our tutoring program, as I discussed, I do a lot of online tutoring myself and in person, you know, when it permits. But I do a lot of tutoring as well. I think it is a really valuable way for students to either iron out their deficiencies maybe in the few weeks coming up to the exam, or, you know, to structure a course that way. If you're the type of person, I know me, I wasn't a perfect student, and I thought it was really valuable for me. While I didn't take advantage of the tutoring, I was very close with my instructor and tried to get a lot of feedback, because I knew, not being a perfect student, that I had to really perform on the LSAT in order to get into my target schools. Blueprint's got some free programs we encourage you to check out as well, both because they give you an idea of what the Blueprint program offers, and because it gives you an idea of where you are in the application process. One of those is the Law School Compass, where we try to take some of the guesswork out of the law school admissions process. You're actually able to input your data, and we'll give you a read as to your likelihood at various schools. We've also got our most strongly supported LSAT blog, which I sometimes contribute to. We've got free webinars offered on a weekly basis that you guys can all tune into, and I'd encourage you to do so. We've also got an IGTV series that we launched about 2 months ago now, which I host, just kind of analyzing, we call it logic fails, analyzing logical fallacies pervasive in the news, in sports, all across Twitter, et cetera. And that's been a lot of fun as well, to try to see how some of what you're learning kind of manifests in the real world. How it's not just a cerebral exercise, not just a geeky test, but to see how you as a lawyer will start to apply these skills down the line. I know we've run a little bit over, folks, but are there any pressing questions? And perhaps I'll let the deans here select which we cover, or cut me off as well since we're running tight.
It's okay. Does anybody have a question for Robert?
I'm looking at the chat here, if that's but I can pull up.
I think Hugo has his physical hand raised. You can unmute Hugo.
Okay, cool. So just a question, the upcoming November LSAT, I know it was supposed to be on the 14th. But then since it was moved to the Flex, they said they'll I heard it was on the 7th, but then I heard from another source that it's going to be different dates in between the 7th and 14th. So could you kind of clarify when I'll know what date it's going to be?
I think it's the last one is what's accurate. So here's the situation now is because they are proctored exams, they don't have the resources for all students to take them at the same time. They need to distribute those resources. I think that that's both human resources, proctors, and just like bandwidth. And I think they want to be in a position where if one of the administrations crashes, then, oh man, we lost 1/9 of our test takers as opposed to 100% of our test takers. So what they're doing is, you're exactly right. They're going to be on a series of dates, a series of times between the 7th and the 14th. In the next, I think it should be within the next like week or two, you will be receiving an update from the LSAC telling you to sign up for which specific slot in that range. So unfortunately, previously you would say, my LSAT date is November 14th. No longer can you say that when you sign up. What you say instead is, my LSAT date is around November 14th, and I'll find out what specific slot on what specific day, only a couple days in advance. I can't lie, it's not a great system because I think some students, want to take, time away from work. And if your work requires that you tell them a month in advance about any kind of planned time away, this puts you in a difficult spot because you're in a tough position to know if you're going to get that type of slot that you can reserve. But unfortunately, yeah, that's where the LSAC is with signups right now. So what I would expect is in the next week or two, you'll get an email from the LSAC saying signups will be coming right up, and you'll get your specific slot then.
Yeah, roughly about 2 weeks prior to the period that they're doing the flex, they try to send those emails out. And then actually, I'm going to steal this from one of our prospective students who said this in a past workshop. A good tip would also be to consider like when you're at your best, if you're a real morning person, when you get the opportunity to, to pick your day and time, pick the time slot that you think you're going to be the best at. Or if, there's noise in your house by a certain time, try to take the test before or after that, or, anything like that that you think could help you be more relaxed or better prepared for the administration.
Cool, thank you.
Great question. Weird times, folks. There's a lot of adjusting here. Some of you guys may have seen this. This question was already answered by Lisa, but I will reiterate as well in case anybody's not looking at the chat. One student asked how the GPA will be calculated and what it's going to include. It's your cumulative GPA. It's your cumulative GPA. So, you got to all gas, no breaks all the way through your 8 semesters or however many semesters of undergrad. It might be the case, maybe you could talk about in an addendum why, your second semester of sophomore year grade was poor. Perhaps you had a family issue pop up, or you tried to work and that ended up taking on too much. Or you could talk about look at the general upward trend in my grades. Maybe I was kind of silly freshman year, but I started to pick it up afterwards. But to a large extent, most schools will be looking at a number. They'll be looking at 3.72, and it's important that you, keep it high. As you send your applications in. Another student asked how much, yeah, my pleasure, asked how much the Blueprint course costs. It's variable for different products. If you go to our Blueprint website, and there you can also activate some of these free resources. The courses range, and this is off the top of my head, so forgive me if I'm off a little bit. The live online courses, I think, range between about $1,300 and $1,800. And the anytime courses, the non-live courses, I think are $1,100. Tutoring comes out to various different price points with different a la carte packages, or there's a discount for larger packages, et cetera, et cetera. It's all laid out on the website. But as may have been already mentioned, and if not, those of you who are in attendance today have access to a $300 discount on the Blueprint Live online courses. So definitely something I'd encourage you guys to take advantage of if you're interested. Remember that taking a course, signing up for a course, the main priority is what's going to work for you. Are you available? Does it time out well with your admission cycle? But $300 off live online courses for anybody in attendance here today.
Yeah, and the admissions office will take care of getting the list over to Blueprint. So
perfect.
No one individual here needs to worry about that.
Excellent. I appreciate that. As someone who thought he might be having to scramble to take roll here, that's
well, you did say you liked paper.
Yeah, that's true. well done there. Another student asked, flaws abstract answer. Flaws abstract answer. On flaw questions, abstract answer language is proving challenging. How would I suggest tackling this? I think that the first thing you need to do for this is to break out some legal jargon. It's important to recognize that the LSAT is a bad faith exam. A bad faith exam in the sense of, let's contrast it to a couple exams that you guys maybe took in like a chemistry course. If you, are doing a chemistry course, a problem on a test that's maybe more math oriented. In many cases, the correct answer might be like 16 times, 6 to the 10th power kind of thing. It could be whatever variation there. And then you'll have that as answer choice A, and B and C and D might be other things that are like kind of way off, right? You just have to pick the correct answer. The LSAT is more like where you have, instead of like to the 12th power, you have another wrong answer choice that's like to the 11th power. And then you have to pause and be like, wait, did I put the decimal in the wrong place? Like, are they trying to confuse me? Like, is this a trick wrong answer choice kind of thing? There's a lot of trick wrong answer choices on the LSAT. Most of the wrong answer choices are designed to seduce you, to seem attractive. Most of the correct answer choices are designed to turn you away, to seem unattractive. So I think that's the first step to getting through some of these abstract language answer choices. And the second, I think at a certain point, just becomes recognizing what kind of anticipation you should come up with that is broad enough to include anything that could be correct. Whereas what more specific anticipation do I expect them to go with in recognition of the fact that they could kind of come out of left field and do something a little bit different. So differentiating between a general anticipation and a more specific anticipation might benefit you as well. Any other questions here, folks?
Yeah, we can take one more question. Anything related? Nope, looks like everybody's good. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you, Robert, for joining us from Blueprint. We appreciate the help and collaboration. If anybody has any additional questions that you think of after tonight's presentation, you'd like to get in touch with the admissions office, please feel free to do so. We're available by phone and by email, regular business hours, always, despite working from home. And join us for subsequent programming. We've got Rosemary Tamayo coming up on Monday. She's the 3L at Southwestern. And then there's a bunch of other events on our admissions website. So please feel free to join us for any and all of those. Have a good night, everybody.